President Grimson, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I appreciate this opportunity to be here. I was asked to speak about U.S. policies and activities in the Arctic. I need to be clear, I'm no longer working for the U.S. government, but I was there for many years working on Arctic issues. I perhaps can speak with a little more freedom now, but the truth is I'm very well invested in what had come before, and I'm not sure I'm completely objective after all. When President Trump was elected, I received a lot of messages from friends and colleagues around the world who cared about Arctic issues, expressing doubt or sometimes trepidation about what the new administration would mean for Arctic policy of the U.S. And if I have one message for you today, the answer to that question is less than you might have thought. And the reason for this lies in the fact that the interests of the United States in the Arctic are actually long-term and enduring and have not actually changed all that much over the decades in which I've been working on it. And I have pictures of four of my close friends from the United States now up on the screen. You may remember the first guy, Bill Clinton. It was in his administration in the early 1990s that the United States articulated a set of 6 goals for the Arctic region, and they're worth mentioning. I'll mention them here. The first one was meeting post-Cold War national security and defense needs. Second, protecting the Arctic environment and conserving its biological resources. Third was assuring that natural resource management and economic development in the region are environmentally sustainable. Next, strengthening institutions for cooperation among the 8 Arctic nations. Fifth, involving Arctic indigenous peoples in decisions that affect them. And finally, enhancing scientific monitoring and research into local, regional, and global environmental issues. That came out in the early 90s, and over the next 15 years, a lot changed for the Arctic. We had the Arctic Council born, climate change, particularly the Arctic, came on the scene. All sorts of things unfolded, and the administration of George W. Bush then finally got around, just as he was leaving office after 8 years, to put out its own Arctic strategy. And despite all those changes, that strategy kept exactly the same 6 goals. The one word that was added was homeland security. Well then, President Obama came to office. People expected a lot of change, and indeed that administration was different in many ways, but really not so different when it came to Arctic policy. Yes, there was a new Arctic policy. I was involved in the development of that one too, the National Strategy for the Arctic region. And although it used some different wording, basically all of those same 6 goals are retained. Yes, there's a difference in emphasis. And in particular, as the end of the Obama administration was coming around, there were 2 things that happened in the world that drew attention in the United States, in particular, to the Arctic. One was the Paris negotiations were coming to fruition, and we had a president and a Secretary of State, John Kerry, who cared quite a lot about that, and they came to the Arctic. Actually, our first sitting president to visit the Arctic occurred in the Obama years, in part to call attention to Arctic climate change and build support for a strong Paris Agreement. At that same time, the United States was chairing the Arctic Council, and that raised the profile of Arctic issues, certainly within the US government, and I think within the United States as a whole. Well, now here we are in the Trump administration. There is not yet a new Arctic policy that the Trump administration has put out, though some of the individual agencies of the US government are updating or working on some of them. And what I feel is happening right now is kind of an odd mixture. On the one hand, the Trump administration has allowed a couple of the signature US activities in the Arctic to come to fruition. One was the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. It was not obvious when Secretary Tillerson came to Fairbanks to chair the Arctic Council Ministerial and to bring to fruition the work that the United States had led during its Arctic Council chairmanship, whether there would be radical changes. Well, there were not. Indeed, he reaffirmed U.S. commitment to the Council, and he signed, on behalf of the United States, the Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement that was one of the outputs of the Arctic Council during the U.S. chairmanship. And later in 2017, we were able to conclude the negotiations of the Arctic Fisheries Agreement that the United States had led, and just a couple of months ago, as many others have mentioned, we signed, along with 9 others, the Arctic Fisheries Agreement. On the other hand, shortly after the U.S. ministerial took place in Fairbanks, the Trump administration announced an intention to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. I remind you that withdrawal has not actually happened yet, but it is also true that the climate policies of the United States under this administration look quite a lot different than the policies of the last one. And one place those policies are certainly going to be felt, if they are not being felt already, is in the Arctic. So, to sum up, the current administration seems to have an odd mix of maintaining continuity in some general ways, including in some important Arctic endeavors that the United States has been involved in, but on the other hand, climate policy, which is so important to the Arctic, has changed rather significantly. As for the future, well, I think the United States and everyone else involved is going to need to think about some new policies. The last 7 years have witnessed the negotiation and conclusion of 5 separate legally binding instruments about the Arctic. I can't think of another part of the planet for which that would be true. 3 of those came through the Arctic Council, the Search and Rescue Agreement, the Marine Oil Pollution, the Arctic Science Agreement. 1 of them came through the International Maritime Organization, the Polar Shipping Code, and the Fisheries Agreement that's been mentioned before. Interesting questions now are before us. How do these fit together? How do a lot of the Arctic institutions that have been growing up in recent years also work together? Is there a need for some new architecture? I think the Trump administration and whatever the next U.S. administration will need to be considering this along with all of our partners who care about the Arctic. Thanks very much.